Miss Pac-Man for the Nintendo Game Boy is the obvious follow-up to Pac-Man for the Nintendo Game Boy. Obviously. Both games were originally arcade games featuring mazes that are far bigger than the tiny Game Boy screen is capable of showing. So the default mode has you scrolling around the screen as you gobble up dots and power pellets, all the while avoiding the monochrome ghosts of death. Just like on Pac-Man on the Game Boy, you could press left or right to access the full screen mode, which shrinks the maze to fit the Game Boy screen, but everything obviously looks tiny. Obviously, this would look better on a Super Game Boy or Game Boy Player accessory, but even on a tiny monochrome Game Boy screen with fair lighting conditions, the game's still visible and still widely playable. If you can see the dots, you have no problem. In any case, if you played Miss Pac-Man in its original arcade format, or quite frankly, any of the many home video game conversions or emulations that have been released over the year, and considering how long Miss Pac-Man's been around, you could guarantee there's plenty of home video game ports, but I digress. This Game Boy iteration is pretty much the same game as before. You move Miss Pac-Man around with about as much responsive control as in the previous Pac effort on Game Boy, and that's not a bad thing. I thought the previous Pac-Boy controlled rather nicely, and this version of Miss Pac-Man holds up nicely in that regard. Like before, all the ghosts have the same shade of insert color here, but again, if you can figure out the patterns that each ghost possess, it'll be one step closer to the survival. I did notice the speed of the game was a tad slower than the arcade original, even on the game's supposed arcade setting. So it feels somewhat easier for lack of a better term, but there is the hard mode, and the game moves about much quicker in that difficulty, which should satisfy some of the people that might cry foul at the slow pace in the supposed arcade setting. And unlike the previous Game Boy port of Pac-Man, none of the featured mazes look to be missing any dots or anything. So it's pretty much the same Miss Pac-Man game as all the others. Well, except for the zoomed-in view and the monochrome color scheme, but whatever. In terms of presentation, Miss Pac-Man looks alright. The zoomed-in mode, all the sprites look about as good as their arcade counterparts. Same for the outline that around Miss Pac-Man, but I suppose that's unavoidable if they wanted to make her visible on the white Game Boy screen. Or insert color here. Whatever. Full screen view looks pretty decent, and even if everything's microscopic, it looks fine and clear. Like I said, if you have good lighting, it's entirely playable on the tiny classic Game Boy. The intermission sequences have been retained from the arcade version, although they now share the same jingle as opposed to having unique jingles like in the arcade original and also any other home video game conversion of Miss Pac-Man. Oops. Sound in Miss Pac-Man is alright, not spectacular in any way, but it's serviceable. It somewhat resembles the arcade original, so, there's not much to say on that regard. Much like Pac-Man did, Miss Pac-Man eventually got a re-release on the Game Boy Color. Haven't played the game, I don't have it, but from my understanding, it's essentially the same game as the original Game Boy port, except that version has color, obviously, and a couple of additional mazes. So if you have a Game Boy Color, that's probably the version you're better off going after. But setting that aside, Miss Pac-Man did get a fine transition to the old Game Boy, and it's pretty much a fun game regardless of how many colors is on screen. There's not much more to say about this one. It's Miss Pac-Man, it's a classic, and it's pretty good on the Game Boy, and it's pretty cheap too. Miss Pac-Man's a cheap date. Yes. Okay, alright, I'm done. Good night.